The Amazon rainforest in eastern Peru stretches without visible boundary. From above, it appears as a continuous canopy of green, unbroken except by winding rivers that move slowly through the lowlands. The region is part of the Greater Amazon Basin, one of the most biologically dense ecosystems on Earth. Heat rises steadily from the forest floor. Moisture hangs in the air. Rain falls often, sometimes in sudden bursts, sometimes in long, steady sheets. In December, the wet season is established. Storm systems build over the Andes and move eastward across the jungle. Rivers swell, tributaries expand beyond their banks. The forest absorbs and conceals almost everything that enters it. Visibility at ground level is limited. The canopy blocks much of the light. Beneath it, layers of vegetation overlap ferns, vines, saplings, fallen trunks in slow decay. Movement is slow without a path. Sound carries differently. Insects hum continuously. Bird calls break the stillness and then disappear. There are few permanent human settlements deep inside this region. Travel is usually by river or small aircraft. Once beneath the canopy, direction becomes difficult to maintain without experience. Distances feel distorted. Landmarks repeat. In 1971, large portions of this forest remained untracked and sparsely monitored. Rescue operations in such terrain were complex and uncertain. On the afternoon of the 24th of December 1971, the forest waited beneath a forming storm system. On the 10th of October 1954, Juliane Koepcke was born in Lima, Peru. She was the only child of two German scientists. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, was a zoologist. Her mother, Maria Koepcke, was an ornithologist known for her research on Peruvian bird species. Both had moved to Peru in the 1940s to conduct fieldwork in the Amazon basin. In 1968, her parents established a biological research station called Panguana near the Uyapichis River, a tributary of the Pachitea River in the central Peruvian rainforest. The station was remote. Access required travel by river and small aircraft. Supplies were limited. The surrounding forest functioned as both laboratory and home. Juliane spent much of her childhood between two environments. During the academic year, she attended school in Lima. During holidays, she joined her parents in the rainforest. Her upbringing exposed her to field research, wildlife observation, and the practical realities of living in isolation. She learned basic navigation techniques and developed familiarity with jungle terrain. Her father taught her a simple principle for orientation. If lost, follow water downstream. Rivers lead to settlements. By late 1971, Juliane was 17 years old. She had recently completed her final exams at the German school in Lima. The Christmas holiday was approaching. Her mother had remained in Lima with her during exam season, while her father had returned earlier to Panguana. On the 24th of December 1971, Juliane and her mother planned to travel from Lima to Pucallpa. From there, they intended to continue onward to the research station. The flight was operated by Líneas Aéreas Nacionales Sociedad Anónima, known as LANSA. The aircraft scheduled for the route was a Lockheed L-188A Electra, a four-engine turboprop designed for medium-range travel. The flight number was 508. Weather conditions that day were unstable. Thunderstorms were common during the rainy season, particularly along routes crossing the eastern slopes of the Andes. Commercial flights in Peru at the time often navigated around visible storm systems rather than through them. Aircraft radar systems were limited compared to modern standards. Despite the seasonal risks, travel by air remained the most practical way to reach the interior. The alternative river travel from Lima was long and indirect. For researchers accustomed to remote logistics, air transport was routine. Juliane boarded the aircraft, seated beside her mother. There were 86 passengers and 6 crew members on board. Among them were families traveling for the holidays, workers returning to regional towns, and children. The flight departed Jorge Chávez International Airport in Lima during the afternoon. Initial ascent was normal. The aircraft turned eastward toward the Andes and the lowland forest beyond. For Juliane, this journey followed a familiar pattern. She had flown similar routes before. The forest below represented home as much as it did wilderness. At the time of departure, there was no public indication that Flight 508 would become one of the most documented survival incidents in aviation history. Lanza Flight 508 climbed eastward from Lima during the afternoon of the 24th of December, 1971. The Lockheed L-188A Electra carried 92 people. Weather systems were visible ahead as the aircraft crossed the Andes toward the Amazon basin. Thunderclouds rose vertically, dense and unstable, common during the wet season. Accounts later, reconstructed from aviation reports, indicate that the aircraft entered a severe storm cell. Turbulence intensified. Passengers observed lightning outside the windows. At approximately 12,000 feet above the jungle, lightning struck the aircraft. Investigators later concluded that the strike likely ignited fuel vapors in one of the wing tanks. Structural failure followed. The right wing separated. The fuselage began to break apart in midair. Juliane Koepcke, still strapped into her seat, was pulled into open sky as the aircraft disintegrated. Sections of the cabin tore free. She later reported seeing the jungle canopy rotating below her. 3 seats remained attached together, her seat and the 2 beside it. The unit descended through cloud and rain. The exact altitude of her fall has been estimated at roughly 10,000 feet, though precise measurement remains uncertain. What is documented is that she remained secured to her seat during descent. The rainforest canopy lay beneath. Dense layers of vegetation can act as partial deceleration, though not uniformly. The seat unit passed through branches before reaching the forest floor. When Juliane regained consciousness, it was daylight. She was alone. The aircraft was no longer visible. The jungle surrounded her in every direction. She was still strapped to the seat. Her collarbone was fractured. She had a deep laceration on her right arm. One eye was swollen nearly shut. She showed signs of concussion. Her glasses were missing. Around her, debris from the aircraft was scattered across the forest floor. There was no immediate sign of other survivors. The storm had moved on. Rain continued lightly through the canopy. The forest returned to its steady rhythm. Juliane unbuckled herself from the seat and stood. Juliane Koepcke stood unsteadily among broken branches and aircraft fragments. The forest floor was uneven and damp. Light filtered through layers of foliage above her. The impact site showed no clear crater. The vegetation had absorbed and dispersed the fall. Her injuries limited movement. The fracture to her right collarbone caused pain when she raised her arm. A deep cut along her right upper arm exposed tissue. Later, medical examination would confirm that she had also suffered a torn anterior cruciate ligament in her knee. At the time, she did not know the full extent of her injuries. She assessed what she could observe. Her first actions were slow and methodical. She called out for her mother. There was no response. She began walking in widening circles, searching for additional survivors or recognizable wreckage. She found scattered debris, pieces of luggage, fragments of fuselage insulation, sections of seat fabric. She did not locate another living passenger. The forest was dense enough that visibility extended only a short distance in any direction. Orientation was difficult without reference points. Her glasses had been lost in the fall, and her vision without them was limited. She later reported that this forced her to move cautiously and conserve energy. Food was not immediately a priority. She had little appetite and no accessible supplies. Among the debris, she located a small bag of candy. It provided limited calories and was consumed gradually. There was no other recoverable equipment. The ground was uneven with fallen timber and undergrowth. Insects gathered quickly around her wound. Mosquitoes were constant. The humidity slowed evaporation of sweat and kept clothing damp. Remaining still invited insects. Movement required strength. As daylight began to fade, Juliane faced the first night alone. She had no shelter beyond the canopy overhead. Temperatures in the Amazon rarely drop sharply at night, but darkness in the forest is near total. Sounds amplify. Insects, amphibians, and distant animal calls form a continuous background. She remained near the debris field that first evening. It was the last known point of the aircraft. Staying nearby increased the possibility that search teams might locate her. Aircraft were already being dispatched from Lima and Pucallpa once the flight was reported missing. During the night, rain fell intermittently. She lay on the forest floor without insulation. Pain from her injuries intensified when she remained still, yet movement risked further damage. Morning returned gradually through filtered light. She began to consider her father's instruction: follow water downstream. On the second day, Juliane Koepcke began moving away from the debris field. Remaining stationary depended on rapid rescue. The Amazon's scale made that uncertain. Aircraft were searching overhead, but the canopy concealed most ground features. She understood that visibility from above was limited. She began walking in a single direction, conserving strength. Her movement was uneven because of her injured knee and collarbone. She kept her right arm close to her body to reduce pain. Progress was slow. Vegetation required stepping over roots and fallen trunks. Vines caught at her clothing. Within hours, she heard running water. It was a narrow stream, shallow and clear. The sound confirmed orientation. Her father's advice had been simple: water leads to larger water, and larger water leads to people. She turned downstream and began following the current. Traveling along the stream provided several advantages. The bank was slightly more open than the forest interior. Fresh water reduced the immediate risk of dehydration. The flow provided direction without reliance on landmarks. She waded at times to avoid dense brush, though this exposed her wounds to insects and microorganisms. She consumed the remaining candy gradually. There were no other reliable food sources she could identify with certainty. Although raised in the forest, she had not been trained in systematic foraging. Her parents conducted scientific research, not survival instruction. She avoided unfamiliar fruits. Aircraft engines became audible on several occasions. Search planes flew overhead during the first days after the crash. She attempted to move into small clearings when she heard them, but the canopy obscured her from view. The search effort eventually shifted focus when no wreckage was easily located from the air. Time in the forest became difficult to measure precisely. She later estimated that she walked for 9 to 10 days. Exact tracking was impossible without a watch or calendar reference. She followed the stream continuously, resting when exhaustion required it. Her physical condition deteriorated gradually. The wound on her arm became inflamed. Insects laid eggs in the exposed tissue. She later described noticing movement inside the wound, but lacked tools to treat it. She did not panic. She continued walking. Rain occurred intermittently. Clothing remained wet for extended periods. The river widened slightly as tributaries joined. Fish were visible in deeper sections, but she had no means to catch them. She drank directly from the stream. At night, she lay beside the water. She did not construct a formal shelter. Her energy was directed toward forward movement during daylight. The forest sounds became familiar. She later stated that fear was not constant. Concentration on practical steps occupied most of her attention. Several times, she encountered debris from the aircraft farther downstream, confirming that sections of the fuselage had fallen along similar trajectories. She did not locate survivors among them. By the later days of her walk, weakness became pronounced. Standing required effort. Her injuries had not improved. The wound in her arm showed signs of infection. She began to see larger waterways ahead, evidence that the stream was feeding into a broader river system. The riverbanks occasionally showed signs of human activity: cut vegetation, small clearings, remnants of paths used by local loggers. These indications reinforced the logic of following water. Her progress remained steady but slow. Each step required balance and attention. The forest did not change in character, but the river's scale increased. After more than a week alone, she reached a wider river bend where signs of human presence were unmistakable. By the time Juliane Koepcke reached the broader river, her physical reserves were nearly depleted. The small stream she had followed had merged into a larger tributary, and the water now moved with greater depth and steadiness. The banks were less obstructed in places, shaped by periodic flooding. Her injuries had not healed. The fracture in her collarbone limited the use of her right arm. Her knee injury slowed her pace. The laceration on her arm had worsened. The humid environment prevented drying, and insects continued to gather around exposed tissue. She later reported that maggots were present inside the wound. Without medical tools, she was unable to remove them effectively. Despite this, her behavior remained structured. She continued to follow the river downstream during daylight and rested at night. There was no recorded instance of her attempting to move inland away from the water. The decision remained consistent with the instruction she had learned in childhood. Food intake was minimal. After the candy was gone, she did not consume any significant calories. There is no confirmed record of her eating plants or animals during this period. Her survival depended largely on hydration and gradual movement. The human body can endure prolonged periods without food when water is available, though strength diminishes steadily. Search operations for Lanza Flight 508 had begun shortly after the aircraft disappeared from radar. Aircraft flew grid patterns over sections of the jungle. However, dense canopy and widespread debris complicated detection. Reports of potential crash sites were inconsistent. Eventually, official search efforts were reduced. The crash location was not definitively identified at that time. Juliane remained unaware of these developments. Her focus was confined to immediate tasks: maintain balance, step forward, avoid injury, remain near water. The forest environment did not offer dramatic shifts. Instead, it imposed repetition. The same layers of vegetation, the same insect sounds, the same humidity. Days blended without markers beyond sunrise and sunset. Her ability to measure distance or time was approximate. Later estimates place her walk at roughly 9 to 10 days, covering several kilometers along interconnected waterways. Psychological strain was present, but not expressed in outward collapse. In later interviews, she described operating in a practical state rather than panic. The absence of other survivors had become apparent. She had called for her mother during the early days but received no answer. As days passed, the likelihood of finding her diminished. The river gradually revealed clearer signs of human use. She observed a small boat tied near the bank at one point, though she did not initially see people nearby. Such indicators suggested proximity to logging activity common in parts of the Peruvian Amazon. Her physical state had reached a threshold. Walking for extended hours was no longer sustainable. She required assistance. Near a bend in the river, she discovered a small shelter structure used by local lumber workers. It was unoccupied at the time. Inside, she located a container of gasoline and basic tools. The presence of these items marked the first stable human trace she had encountered since the crash. She remained there and waited. The shelter by the river provided limited protection, but no immediate assistance. Juliane Koepcke remained there, conserving what strength she had left. The structure consisted of a simple wooden frame and roof, used intermittently by local lumber workers. There were no permanent occupants at that moment. Her wound required attention. Remembering that gasoline could kill parasites in animal tissue, she poured a small amount of fuel over the infected area of her arm. The liquid caused immediate pain. The treatment was improvised, but effective in forcing maggots to surface. She later reported removing several larvae from the wound. It was a temporary intervention rather than a cure, but it reduced the immediate infestation. Exhaustion was now constant. After more than a week without substantial food, weakness limited movement. She remained near the shelter, expecting that workers might return. The river continued its steady flow beside her. Time was no longer measured by distance walked, but by waiting. In the days following the crash, official reports had already begun to assume that there were no survivors. The wreckage of Flight 508 had not been located in full. Families in Lima and Pucallpa received notifications. Her father, stationed at Panguana, was informed of the aircraft's disappearance. Juliane did not know the broader circumstances. She understood only that she was alone, and that rescue had not yet come. Aircraft sounds had grown less frequent. The forest resumed its ordinary rhythm. Insects gathered at dusk. Rain fell intermittently. The isolation carried weight, but it did not produce outward dramatics. She remained still, conserving energy, positioned where human presence was most likely to appear. After several hours at the shelter, she heard voices approaching along the river. The voices belonged to 3 Peruvian lumber workers traveling by boat along the river. When they reached the shelter, they found Juliane Koepcke lying nearby, weak and visibly injured. Her clothing was torn. Her arm showed signs of infection. She identified herself and stated that she had survived the crash of Flight 508. The men were initially cautious. Reports of the missing aircraft had circulated, but the assumption had been that no one had survived. Recognizing her condition, they provided immediate assistance. They gave her food in small amounts and allowed her to rest. Because of the distance and terrain, immediate transport to a hospital was not possible that same day. The following morning, they transported her by boat downriver to a nearby settlement. From there, she was eventually flown to a hospital in Pucallpa. Medical examination confirmed a fractured collarbone, a torn ligament in her knee, deep lacerations, and severe insect infestation in her wound. She was treated for infection and dehydration. Authorities confirmed that she was the sole survivor among the 92 people on board Lanza Flight 508. Her mother's body was later located. She had survived the initial breakup but died from her injuries several days afterward. The full wreckage site was eventually identified in the jungle. Juliane's rescue occurred 10 days after the crash. There was no public celebration in the forest clearing where she had waited. The river continued its steady movement as it had before her arrival. Following hospitalization, Juliane Koepcke underwent a period of recovery. Wounds healed, fractures stabilized, and infection resolved. Her injuries left no permanent impairment beyond minor scarring and reduced strength in the injured arm. The incident was recorded in aviation and survival literature as one of the rare cases of an unassisted individual surviving a mid-air fall and extended isolation in the Amazon rainforest. In subsequent years, she returned to the study of biology, following the path set by her parents. She worked in zoological and ecological research, including projects in Peru and Germany. Years later, she revisited the site of the crash, documenting the location and the surrounding forest, now partially altered by human activity, but still dense and largely uninhabited. The survival of Flight 508's sole passenger underscores the interplay between human knowledge, instinct, and environmental circumstance. Familiarity with the forest, early instruction regarding orientation, and disciplined adherence to practical steps contributed to the outcome. In the Amazon, the forest endures, rivers flow, the canopy shifts with rain and wind. Individual lives intersect briefly with this landscape. Juliane Koepcke's story became part of the historical record, a testament to resilience in extreme isolation. Yet, in the forest itself, nothing altered. The environment continued its quiet persistence, indifferent to the passage of time. The incident concluded not with celebration, but with documentation, reflection, and eventual integration into the wider history of human survival.